The moment I stepped into the courtroom, I could feel it. Something was off. It wasn't the usual tension that came with legal battles. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The kind of silence that settles when people already know the outcome before a single word is said. I walked toward my seat, my eyes sweeping the room. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens scratching against their notepads. A few cameras flashed, catching glimpses of me as I adjusted my tie. Across from me, the defense team sat with their client, a man accused of corruption so deep it made headlines for weeks. But it wasn't him I was focused on. It was the man at the bench, Judge Randall Moore. His reputation had followed him long before I ever stepped foot in this courtroom. He was known for his sharp tongue, his ruthless rulings, and most of all, his connections. Some whispered that he didn't just interpret the law, he decided who it applied to. Today, I would see for myself if those whispers were true. He barely looked up as he flipped through a stack of papers. His fingers tapped impatiently against the desk, his expression one of boredom. Then, without lifting his head, he spoke. "I see we have the great J.D. Vance in my courtroom today." The words hung in the air. Not Senator Vance. Not Mr. Vance. Just J.D., like I was some kid from the neighborhood getting scolded. A few chuckles rippled through the room. I didn't react. I knew better than to give him what he wanted. He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "Are we going to waste the court's time today with a political performance? Or do you actually have something worth saying?" The chuckles grew louder. I could feel every eye on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I leaned forward. "Your Honor, I'm here because the people deserve a fair trial. That's all." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fairness," he repeated, as if the word itself was a joke. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel against the desk. "You know, I always find it amusing when politicians walk in here pretending they care about fairness. Last time I checked, this courtroom isn't a campaign stop." More laughter. This time, it wasn't just the defense team. Even a few spectators joined in. My jaw tightened, but I didn't break eye contact. Judge Moore let the laughter die down before continuing. "All right then, let's get on with it. You may proceed, but keep in mind, Senator, I have little patience for grandstanding." I nodded and turned to the first witness, a man who had worked under the defendant for years. He had seen the corruption up close, felt its weight firsthand. He was ready to speak. But before he could even open his mouth, Moore raised a hand. "Actually, on second thought, I'm going to allow the defense to raise their objections before we get too deep into this. Let's not waste time if this is all just a political stunt." I turned back to him, my patience wearing thin. "Your Honor, the witness hasn't even spoken yet. How can there be an objection?" He shrugged. "Call it experience." My grip on the table tightened. This wasn't just bias. This was something else. He wasn't just pushing back. He was shutting it down before it even started. The defense attorney stood up, smirking. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that this witness's testimony be dismissed on the grounds of irrelevance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Irrelevance? He worked directly under the defendant for over a decade. Judge Moore raised a hand again. "That's enough, Senator. I'll decide what's relevant here, not you." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Motion granted. The witness is dismissed." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. I turned to my team, their faces a mix of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't just bad judging. This was something deliberate. He was making sure this case never even got off the ground. Before I could say another word, Moore leaned forward. "A word of advice, J.D. If you want to play a lawyer, maybe you should have gone to law school instead of the Senate." The room went dead silent. My chest tightened. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This was personal, and that's when I realized something. He wasn't just mocking me. He was warning me. I wasn't supposed to be here. The gavel's sharp crack still echoed in my ears. Judge Moore sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but I could see it in his eyes. Satisfaction. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just dismissing a witness. He was shutting the door on this case before it even had a chance to begin. I turned slightly, looking at the man who had been ready to testify. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw clenched tight. He wasn't just frustrated, he was afraid. That realization hit me harder than anything Moore had said. What was he afraid of? Was it the judge? The defendant? or something bigger? I didn't have time to dwell on it. Moore was already moving on, flipping through a stack of papers as if he hadn't just silenced a key witness. All right, let's not waste any more time, he said, glancing up at the defense attorney. Do you have any further motions before we proceed? The defense attorney stood up, his confidence unmistakable. Your Honor, given the clear lack of credible testimony from the prosecution, I'd like to file a motion to dismiss the case in its entirety. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. I barely heard them. My focus was on Moore. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He just tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. I rose from my seat. Your Honor, we haven't even had the chance to present our case. You've dismissed a witness without hearing a single word of testimony. How can you justify throwing out the entire case? Moore let out a slow sigh, like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Senator, let me remind you, again, that this is my courtroom, not yours, and I don't take kindly to lectures on how to do my job. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. I'm not questioning your job, Your Honor. I'm questioning your fairness. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, just for a second. Then it was gone. The motion to dismiss is under review, he said, his voice cool. I will consider it over recess. Court is adjourned until then. The gavel slammed down again, and just like that, the session was over. People started filing out, whispering to each other. Some reporters scribbled notes, others whispered into microphones. My team huddled together, clearly just as stunned as I was. I turned to them, but before I could speak, a man stepped into my path. Senator Vance, he said in a low voice. I looked up. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Something about him felt different from the reporters, the attorneys, even the security guards. He pulled out a badge, barely flashing it before tucking it away again. FBI, I need a moment of your time. I felt my pulse quicken. Now. I followed him out of the courtroom, weaving through the crowd until we stepped into a quiet hallway. He glanced around before speaking. You made an impression today, he said. I folded my arms. Not sure that's a good thing. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. Depends on how you look at it. I studied him carefully. Why is the FBI interested in this case? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. We've been keeping an eye on Judge Moore for a while now. That got my attention. What are you saying? He unfolded the paper, revealing a single name scribbled in the center. I didn't recognize it. What is this? I asked. A pattern, he said. A connection. We think Moore isn't just protecting corrupt officials. We think he's part of something much bigger. I frowned, trying to make sense of it all. And what does this have to do with me? The agent's expression turned serious. Because, Senator, you just walked into the middle of it. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A blocked number. I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I answered. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low and rough. Back off, JD. I froze. My grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? The line went dead. The dead air on the other end of the call sent a chill down my spine. I pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. No name, no number, just silence. Whoever it was didn't need to say anything else. The message was clear. The FBI agent beside me must have noticed the change in my expression. Threat. I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter than I realized. Looks that way. He didn't seem surprised. Not unexpected. I turned to him. Not unexpected? You seem awfully calm about this. He shrugged. Let's just say it confirms what we already suspected. Someone doesn't want you digging any deeper. I narrowed my eyes. And you? What exactly are you digging into? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the hallway, as if making sure no one was close enough to hear. Judge Moore isn't just protecting corrupt officials. He's been actively interfering in cases that could expose people with real power. I folded my arms. You have proof. The agent let out a breath. Not enough to take him down. Not yet, but we're getting close. I studied him for a long moment. So what do you need from me? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper, pressing it into my hand. This is the name of someone who used to work under Moore. They've been too afraid to come forward, but they might talk to you. I glanced at the name. It wasn't familiar. And what happens if they don't? The agent's jaw tightened. Then more walks. And so do the people backing him. Before I could respond, a voice called from the end of the hall. Senator Vance. I turned to see one of my aides rushing toward me, her face flushed. You need to see this. She handed me a tablet, already queued up to a news broadcast. A well-dressed anchor was speaking, her voice sharp and urgent. Breaking news from inside the courthouse. Sources confirm that Judge Randall Moore is considering an immediate dismissal of all charges in the corruption trial, citing insufficient evidence and waste of judicial resources. This move comes as a shock to many, given the high-profile nature of the case. More updates to follow. I felt my stomach drop. He's shutting it down. The FBI agent nodded grimly. And once he does, it'll be nearly impossible to reopen it. My mind raced. If Moore made his ruling, the case would be dead in the water. The evidence we had would mean nothing. The people he protected would remain untouchable. I looked back at the agent. You said I walked into the middle of something. What exactly am I in the middle of? He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, something bigger than just a corrupt judge. My phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. This time, I let it ring. I let the phone ring, my eyes locked on the FBI agent. He watched me carefully, like he was measuring how I'd react. Not going to answer, he asked. I shook my head. Whoever it is, they don't want a conversation. They want control. The phone finally stopped buzzing, leaving a tense silence between us. My aide was still standing nearby, gripping the tablet with the news report frozen on the screen. Judge Moore was moving fast. Too fast. I turned back to the agent. You said Moore isn't working alone. Who's pulling the strings? He exhaled, glancing toward the courtroom doors. We don't have names. Just patterns. Cases that should have been open and shut getting thrown out. People disappearing before they can testify. Money moving in ways it shouldn't. And it all leads back to Moore. I clench my jaw. And if he dismisses this case, it sends a message. That they can get away with it. I didn't need to hear anything else. I turned and walked back toward the courtroom. My aide followed close behind. Senator, what's the plan? I didn't answer right away. Because I didn't have one. Not yet. When we stepped back inside, the energy in the room had changed. The defense attorneys sat back in their chairs, looking more confident than before. The prosecution side, my side, looked tense. Like they already knew what was coming. Judge Moore entered a moment later. He didn't rush. Didn't even seem to acknowledge the weight of what was happening. He just took his seat, adjusted his robe, and cleared his throat. I've reviewed the arguments, he began, his voice carrying through the courtroom, and I have come to a decision regarding the motion to dismiss. I gripped the edge of the table, every muscle in my body tense. Moore folded his hands together, pausing just long enough to make everyone hold their breath. This case, he said finally, is a waste of this court's time. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The defense attorney smirked. The lead prosecutor lowered his head. Moore picked up his gavel. As such, I am granting the motion to. The courtroom doors burst open. Every head turned as a second FBI agent strode in, flanked by two officers. The first agent, the one I had spoken to, was right behind them. Judge Moore froze, his grip tightening around the gavel. What is the meaning of this? The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a document. Your Honor, we have a federal warrant for your arrest. The room fell silent. Moore's face didn't change at first. Then his eyes flicked to me. A slow, burning rage filled them. You, he hissed. I didn't move. Didn't blink. The agent continued. Judge Randall Moore, you are being charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and bribery. Moore's jaw clenched. This is outrageous. You have no authority to interrupt my court. The agent cut him off. This is no longer your court, Judge. Moore slammed his gavel down. This is a political attack. A sham. The officers moved closer. Sir, stand up. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then, slowly, he rose from his chair. His face was pale now, his confidence draining away. As they pulled out the cuffs, he turned to me one last time. His voice was low, shaking with barely contained fury. This isn't over, Vance. I met his stare. Yes, it is. The cuffs clicked shut. And just like that, The most powerful man in this courtroom wasn't a judge anymore. The gavel never came down. The sound of metal clicking around Judge Moore's wrists filled the courtroom instead. Every eye in the room was locked on him, watching as two federal agents tightened the handcuffs. The once powerful man who had controlled this courtroom with a single word now stood stiff, silent, his face pale but burning with fury. I expected an uproar, a protest from the defense team, a shocked outcry from the spectators. But for a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if no one knew whether this was real. Then the murmurs began, soft at first, then louder, spreading through the room like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to grab their phones. Camera shutters clicked nonstop. Lawyers whispered furiously to one another. Moore finally found his voice. "This is absurd." His words cut through the noise, but there was a shake in them. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is my courtroom, my case." The lead FBI agent didn't flinch. Not anymore. One of the officers reached for Moore's arm, but he yanked it away. "I am a federal judge. Do you understand what that means?" I stepped forward. "It means the law still applies to you." His head snapped toward me. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now held something else. Something closer to desperation. "You think you've won, Vance?" His voice was quieter now, but the bitterness in it was sharp as a blade. "You think this changes anything?" I kept my expression steady. "I think it's a start." The officers took him by the arms. This time, he didn't resist. But as they led him toward the doors, he turned his head just enough to give me one last look. A warning. Then he was gone. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed to the front, shouting questions. The defense attorney threw up his hands, demanding an explanation. The judge's seat sat empty, a symbol of the power that had just been ripped away. I turned to the FBI agent. "How did you pull that off so fast?" He didn't look at me, just handed a folder to the prosecutor. We had enough evidence to move. The timing just worked in our favor. I didn't believe that for a second. The timing wasn't luck. It was pressure. Someone higher up had made a call. Someone wanted Moore gone now. I glanced toward the defense table. The lawyers were already gathering their things, their client standing with his arms crossed, unreadable. The case wasn't dismissed yet, but it had just been thrown into chaos. The lead prosecutor flipped through the folder, then let out a long breath. "This changes everything." I wasn't so sure. I stepped out of the courtroom into the hallway, my mind still racing. Moore had been untouchable for years. Now he was in cuffs. But why now? Who had finally decided he was disposable? My phone buzzed. Another blocked number. I didn't hesitate this time. I answered. A deep voice spoke, slow and steady. "You made a mistake, Vance." I kept walking, gripping the phone tighter. "Seems like I made the right one." A low chuckle. Moore was never the end of this. The line went dead. I stopped walking. The courthouse buzzed with reporters and officials moving in every direction, but I suddenly felt alone in the middle of it. Because for the first time since this started, I realized the line went dead, but the words still echoed in my mind. Moore was never the end of this. I lowered the phone, staring at the black screen like I could pull the voice back and demand answers. But I already knew what it meant. Moore's arrest wasn't a victory. It was a warning. I turned and walked toward the exit, pushing through the swarm of reporters clogging the courthouse halls. Cameras flashed in my face. Microphones shoved forward, voices overlapping in a flood of questions. "Senator Vance, did you know the FBI was going to arrest Judge Moore today? Do you believe this case will continue without him on the bench? Are you concerned about retaliation?" That last question hit harder than the rest. I stopped, scanning the crowd. Somewhere in this chaos, someone was watching me. Someone who wasn't just here for the news. I pushed forward, my aide keeping pace beside me. "Your car's ready," she said. We stepped outside, and the cool air hit me like a splash of water. The sun had already started setting, casting long shadows across the street. My security detail stood near the car, scanning the area. I opened the door, but before I got in, a man across the street caught my eye. He was too still, too focused. Not a reporter, not part of the usual courthouse crowd. His gaze locked onto mine for a split second before he turned and disappeared down an alley. I hesitated. Then I made a decision. Take the car back to the office, I told my aide. She frowned. Where are you going? I didn't answer. I just started walking. I crossed the street and stepped into the alley. It was darker than I expected, the tall buildings blocking out what little light remained. The air smelled like damp concrete and old cigarettes. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing. The man was ahead, just turning another corner. Hey, I called out. He didn't stop. I picked up my pace. If you've got something to say to me, say it to my face. The alley opened up into a small side street. I stepped out, scanning the area. He was gone. I exhaled sharply. Maybe it was being paranoid. Maybe I wasn't. My phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. I didn't answer this time. I just stared at it until it stopped. Then a message popped up on my screen. Just 4 words. Turn back. Walk away. I tightened my grip on the phone. Whoever sent this didn't understand something about me. I wasn't going anywhere. I stared at the message on my phone. Turn back. Walk away. The words sat there, glowing against the dark screen, daring me to obey. But that wasn't going to happen. I turned back toward the main street, my heart hammering a little harder now. The city buzzed around me. Cars honking, people talking, the distant sound of sirens, but none of it felt normal anymore. It felt staged, like background noise meant to make me think nothing was wrong. I made my way to my office, pushing through the revolving doors and heading straight for my private elevator. My aide rushed up to me before the doors closed. Senator, you need to see this, she said out of breath. I sighed. Can it wait? She shook her head and shoved the tablet into my hands. I glanced down. It was a leaked document. I frowned. What am I looking at? She tapped the screen. These are sealed case files. Cases that never made it to court. All dismissed under Moore's authority. Look at the signatures. I scrolled down. One name kept appearing over and over again. Not just Moore's. Another judge. Another official. People I recognized. People I had once trusted. My stomach twisted. Moore wasn't working alone. I looked up. Where did you get this? Her face was pale. It was emailed to me. No name. No return address. I set the tablet down. Someone was feeding us information. But why? My phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. I exhaled and answered. Who is this? Silence. Then, the same deep voice from before. You didn't listen. I gripped the phone tighter. If you have something to say, say it. A pause. Then a quiet chuckle. You think you're in control, but you're not. Moore was a pawn. The real players are still in the game. I walked to the window, staring out over the city. Then tell me who they are. You already know, the voice said. You just don't want to believe it. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, my mind spinning. The case against Moore had felt like a win. But now I realized it had just been a move on someone else's board. A knock at the door. My aide again, her face even more worried. Senator, she said, Moore's out on bail. I froze. What? She nodded. He walked out an hour ago. No one's talking about how. No one's answering questions. I turned back to the window, gripping the edge of my desk. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stare at my aide, waiting for her to say something, anything that would change what I just heard. But she didn't, because there was nothing to change. Moore was out. I exhaled sharply, forcing my hands to unclench. Who posted bail? She shook her head. No name. No paper trail. Of course not. I turned away from her, pacing toward the window. The city stretched out beneath me, busy, unaware. The news had barely broken, and already, the people behind Moore were covering their tracks. I ran a hand through my hair. Where is he now? She hesitated. No one knows. He didn't go home. He didn't go to any known properties. He just disappeared. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone had pulled him out of this. Someone powerful. And now he was loose. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Vance, the voice on the other end said. I went still. Moore. A low chuckle. Surprised. My grip tightened around the phone. Not really. Good. Then you already know what comes next. I exhaled slowly. You're running. Running? He laughed. No, Senator. I'm just getting started. I turned away from the window, pulse pounding. You think you can walk away from this? The FBI has evidence. Your connections won't protect you forever. Silence for a beat. Then his voice dropped lower. I don't need forever. Just long enough. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. Long enough for what? You'll see. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart hammering. Moore wasn't scared. He wasn't desperate. He was calm, because he knew something I didn't. My aide took a step closer. Senator, what do we do? I looked up at her, then back at the city below. This wasn't just about Moore anymore. It never had been. The people behind him weren't done, and neither was I. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.